Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Tradition podcast. My name is Alex Sacken, and today I'm presenting the conclusion of my 5-part series on Pythagorean philosophy, and the focus of this section is going to be on the golden ratio, and I'm going to try to connect it to some of the fundamentals of Pythagorean philosophy that we've been talking about over the course of this series. So I hope you'll stay tuned. This is going to be kind of a longer episode. This is a longer article that I'm going to be going over. It's on my Substack, which is like a blog. And again, this is part of a longer series that I've been doing on that blog. And this whole series comes together to form the chapters of a book. So, again, today's episode is on the subject of the golden ratio. And I have a lot of books on the topic, but there's not one that I've found that presents the argument that I'm going to be presenting in the way that I present it. So this is an original thesis, I guess you would say, but it's not really original because, as I'm going to be going over in one of the sections, there is a rich lineage of esoteric literature that points to this golden ratio in the past. So this is clearly, and when you also look at the monuments, ancient temple structures, they're all designed according to the golden ratio. So clearly the golden ratio is something that was revered and known by the ancient priesthood, and by the custodians of the mystery schools, and was taught in the mystery schools. And as I'll show in this later in this paper, quoting the work of a guy named Scott Olsen, who wrote one of the best books on the golden section that I found. I'm going to be quoting, based on his work, some quotes from Plato, actually, and show how Plato encodes the golden section and the golden ratio in his writings. And we're going to discuss why he had to encode it, because number one, because it seems that this was an important element of the ancient mysteries. And as an initiate of the ancient mysteries, Plato would have been under obligation to not reveal the whole truth, but rather to only indicate it in a way that would stimulate the students to go and seek out the knowledge for themselves. So one had to be initiated into this knowledge in previous eras. So this is a important subject, and that's why I'm calling it, this current section, the golden ratio proof of the divine presence. So in a way, the golden ratio's existence that scientists observe and find throughout nature, wherever life is found, the golden ratio is observed as some element of the design of that life form. And so the fact that there's this ubiquitous design at all levels of the golden ratio is a type of proof of concept. As I will be arguing over the course of this article, it's a proof of concept of the Pythagorean principle of the triad, which is that of the divine self, which is indicating the idea that there's one consciousness that is within creation, experiencing all aspects of creation. So that is the divine self. That's the child principle of the Holy Trinity. So this father, mother, child concept, and what the child concept of deity means, references in philosophy, that was all gone over in our previous article, part 4. So this article is going to be building off of that foundation, but now covering new territory with the golden ratio. So I want to get into it. The first section is called Pythagorean Philosophy and the Golden Ratio, and this is where I'm going to introduce the topic. All right, before I begin this section, I just want to point out that all of the sections in this chapter, just as in all the sections in all my chapters, really, except for maybe the early ones, are accompanied by visuals. So each section has its own visual. And when it comes to the golden ratio, these visuals are pretty important. So take the time to go look at the written article if you have the chance. And you can find the link to my Substack at my website, www.alexsacken.com. But it's also called The Wisdom Tradition. So thewisdomtradition.substack.com will also take you there. And it's free to subscribe. Okay, let's begin this section. This essay is the 5th and concluding part of a 5-part series on Pythagorean philosophy. The focus of this section is on the esoteric symbolism and meaning of the golden ratio, which is also commonly called the golden section or divine proportion. Sometimes it is also simply called phi for reasons that we will see below. Phi is phi, phi. In the sections that follow, I'm going to describe what the golden ratio is, how it's measured, and where in nature it can be found. Then, having established this foundation, I'm going to discuss why in esoteric philosophy this particular geometric proportion is revered as such an important symbol. Here, we will discover why this simple geometric concept was held in such high regard by not only the great Greek sages of Pythagoras and Plato, but also by the mystery schools, master masons, and temple builders of antiquity. This reverence can be found across all cultures, from Asia, the Americas, to Greece to Egypt. In fact, it was the Egyptian priesthood that was the original source of the Grecians' knowledge concerning the topic of the golden ratio. Both Pythagoras and Plato were initiates of the Egyptian mysteries. So that's where they got it from. As we proceed in our discussion of the golden ratio, I'm going to be referencing back to previous elements that we've already covered in this series on Pythagorean philosophy. In particular, I'll be making frequent revisits to the Pythagorean principle of the triad. The overall aim here is to highlight how the golden ratio shares an intimate and immediate relationship to the core ideas of the Pythagorean school's perspective on the esoteric significance of the number 3. So we're going to be relating this triad, or the principle of 3, with the golden ratio, because the golden ratio is a 3-termed proportion. It's a special type of 3-termed proportion. So the relationship between these 3 terms of the golden ratio is going to align with how the 3 principles of the Pythagorean triad are presented. And this triad, remember, it represents the divine self. This is the self that's operating through the world soul. So it impresses itself through the world soul in 3 forms, or in 3 worlds, and that's spirit, soul, body, essentially. So this is the foundation of that teaching. It comes from this understanding of the triad, and so this understanding of the triad is really how you unlock the philosophy of the golden section. Like, why is it so important? Why was it so revered? Because in a way, it's a type of proof of concept and a sort of master blueprint for how this relationship of the triad works, or is how it was depicted and described by the Pythagoreans. The fact that scientists observe the golden ratio ubiquitously throughout nature, from the anatomical design of the individual human organism to the collective design of the Earth ecosystem, up to the interplanetary design of the solar system as a whole, these all serve as a form of scientific proof that both supports and validates the thinking of the ancient Pythagorean sect. The fact that the golden ratio can be ubiquitously found in every aspect of nature that scientists observe is a form of scientific proof of deity's omnipresence within creation. Wherever life, energy, motion, and structure are to be found, the geometry of the golden ratio is subtly present. It is one of the key elements of life's blueprint. See any decent book on the golden ratio, and there are many well-illustrated volumes available, but see any decent book for depictions and diagrams of how this sacred geometry is encoded throughout nature, mankind, and the universe as a whole. The main point is that it is well known among scholars and lay people alike how ubiquitous within nature the golden section is. In Pythagorean philosophy, the 3 principles of the golden section, or the golden ratio, are associated with the philosophic principle of the triad. This is what I just said earlier. When we link these 2 concepts together, the triad and the golden ratio, we begin to appreciate the simple but profound spiritual implication that the golden ratio is indicating to us. Deity, manifesting its consciousness in the form of a triad, leaves a living signature of its presence everywhere in nature. This living signature is triadic and is expressed as the golden ratio, which is a unique 3-term geometric proportion whose measurements are encoded in the material fabric of life at all levels of existence, from the atom to the solar system. So that's the importance of the golden ratio, is that it's a living signature of this triad, this divine self. That's what the Pythagorean teachings are describing the self as, this triad. This divine self is this forms as the triad, and then the golden ratio is the impression of that triad on nature, and that's why it's an inherent part of life, because life is that divine self. That is the source of life. Referencing back to our discussion of systems, the existence of the golden ratio appears as a core design feature that all systems innately share in common. To be a system, meaning to draw upon the system archetype, is to embody and express the golden ratio as a fundamental design feature in one's own being. In a universe of systems within systems, it is no wonder the golden ratio can be found everywhere. So that's linking things back to the previous article. So this is the conclusion of this first chapter, this introduction chapter. The next one is called The Golden Section and the Golden Ratio. And this is when I explain the fundamentals of what the golden ratio is as a geometric principle. And I note in the very beginning, I just have a note that a lot of the material in this section, even though I have several books on the golden ratio and I've read a lot on the topic, actually curiously, it's a topic that Manly Hall only references indirectly. I have a couple quotes from Manly Hall in here, clearly indirectly referencing the existence of this mathematical principle, but I've never seen in his writings a direct reference to it. So in some way, he honors the sort of tradition of Plato. In a lot of ways, he's like Plato, or his style of teaching is like Plato's, and that certain things he doesn't give out openly, but kind of conceals and spreads hints around his various works. But the golden ratio is one of these things that he only alludes to indirectly, but he does have allusions to it, so those are coming. But this section is heavily influenced by, and also cites directly, the work of philosopher Scott Olsen, and his small book titled The Golden Section, Nature's Greatest Secret, which is published by Wooden Books, which is a wonderful wonderful publishing house. And they have these in-house artists that do incredible work. So it's a beautifully illustrated book, along with their other ones. You should really get their volumes, the Quadrivium, I really recommend. And they have a bunch of other amazing books on like the esoteric sort of design of the solar system and the planets and all of that. So anyway, Scott Olsen also has a really good paper, like a white paper from 2002 called the Indefinite Dyad, and I also referenced that. And I want to say at the beginning of this section, I have a simple hand-drawn diagram of the golden section. It's not even exact, I just hand drew it, sort of approximate, but it shows the relationship between the three principles involved. And we're going to go into in a second what these principles are, but for a diagram, you can check out the article. So let's begin. As introduced above, the golden ratio describes a special and unique type of three-termed geometric proportion, whose relationship pattern reveals the triadic workings of a single divine self. In particular, the golden ratio demonstrates the truth that nature itself is organized according to a triangulated pattern, with two opposing extremes, a thesis and antithesis, counterbalanced at all times by a third intermediary element, which in the case of the golden ratio is termed the golden mean. The function of this golden mean is to equilibrate and synthesize the two opposing extremes that accompany it in such a way that the three are made to work harmoniously as one. The one behind the three is the self. The three within the one are the three worlds of the soul or mind that the self is moving its consciousness through. In sum, the triad, which is the divine self, inhabits creation through the linking of triads, i.e. through triangulation, with the golden ratio being the initial manifest triad from which this entire chain of being descends. Let's now unpack this further. The fundamental cosmology of esoteric philosophy is premised upon the idea that God, as a unity, expresses itself creatively by partitioning its oneness into a threeness or triad. When this triad emerges, unity remains always over top, with the three principles of the triad or trinity existing within it. Together, these three elements or principles of this trinity form an inseparable bond with each other, such that the three really operate and function as one. The primary philosophic value and importance of the golden ratio is that it depicts the spiritual partitioning of one into three, using the cool, impersonal language of number, geometry, and mathematics. The fact that scientists observe the presence of this sacred ratio universally throughout nature serves as a type of abstract scientific proof of the ancient Pythagorean teachings about the divine nature of the triad. But before going further with that discussion, we need to first introduce and explore what the golden ratio is, how it's defined, and what makes it unique within the world of esoteric philosophy and sacred geometry. Let's begin by reviewing some simple definitions for the mathematical terms ratio and proportion, as the golden ratio is a special form of these two mathematical principles. At root, the mathematical concepts of ratio and proportion are about comparing and contrasting two or more numbers, with the aim of locating an underlying pattern between them. Ratio is, simply put, the relationship of one number to another. So for example, when you write a ratio, let's say 1 is to 2, you would write 1:2. And a colon is just two dots above one another. So when you make that symbol 1:2, then that means 1 is to 2. So 1 is to 2 or 4 is to 8 are two examples of ratios. And in each case, one value, such as the number 1 and number 4, is linked to or related to another, such as 2 or 8. So then proportion comes into play as the comparison of one ratio against another. For example, 1 is to 2 as 4 is to 8. So you would write this as 1 colon 2. And then so 1 is to 2 is a 1 colon 2. And then as is 2 colons next to each other. So colon, or dot, there's 2 sets of, so you have 4 dots overall, and it's separating the 2 ratios. So 1 is to 2 as 4 is to 8. And 4 is to 8 is 4 colon 8. So 1 is to 2 as 4 is to 8 is an example of a proportion. And so in technical terms, this is actually called a discontinuous geometric proportion. Again, I'm taking this from Scott Olsen's analysis. Among the various types of proportions studied by mathematicians, there is one particular kind of proportion called a three-termed continuous geometric proportion that is of crucial importance to our discussion of the golden ratio. While most discontinuous proportions are stated in the style above, with one ratio of 2 numbers compared to another ratio of 2 numbers, meaning 4 total numbers are involved in the analysis. So by contrast to that, continuous geometric proportions are unique in that they express proportion using only 3 numbers. So they don't have 4 numbers, they have 3. Here, in this 3-term proportion, we find that the first term, such as the number 1, is to the second term, such as the number 3, as the second term, 3, is to a third term, in this case 9. So as a mathematical equation, the statement can be expressed as 1 is to 3 as 3 is to 9, but since you're repeating the number 3, you can then reduce that to the simple statement, which is 1 colon 3 colon 9. 1 is to 3 as 3 is to 9, but you're just stating it with those 3 terms. So that's the 3-term continuous geometric proportion, but that's a normal example of it. Now the golden ratio is a special example of it, and so we're going to be talking about what makes it special. The golden ratio describes a special type of continuous geometric proportion, one that must be discovered geometrically rather than numerically. So the previous example was a numerical example, but the golden ratio deals with a set of 2 numbers that are like the mathematical principle of pi, that these are not expressed as a whole number, it's an infinitely repeating number. So they're called irrational numbers. So because they're irrational numbers, you can't discover the golden ratio by playing around with numbers themselves. It has to be discovered geometrically, meaning through the division of a line, a certain way of dividing a line. And that the point of division is the point that's marked by this special geometric relationship. And when you measure it, it becomes this irrational number. But when you look at it as a proportion, the 3 principles involved fit together perfectly. So the golden ratio is a unique type of 3-term proportion in that its discovery must come from the segmentation of a line rather than from the comparison of ratios of whole numbers. This is because 2 of the measurements of this 3-term proportion are, like pi, irregular numbers, which can't be expressed in decimal form because the number value behind the decimal continues indefinitely. For this reason, the golden ratio must be derived geometrically. More specifically, it is derived from a particular way of segmenting a line. If you cut a line in 2 at approximately the 61% mark, then the proportion that results between the lengths of the 2 resulting line segments, so after you make the mark, you split the line into 2 unequal line segments, when added to the original length of the initial unsegmented line, so you take the 2 lengths that result from the incision plus the length of the original line. So you have 3 lengths now, the original plus the 2 that are created from the cut. So when you add it to the original length of the initial unsegmented line, you get 3 distinct values. And these 3 values fit into a special 3-term continuous geometrical proportion relationship, one which philosophers for millennia have been calling the golden ratio. Note, in the above description, the one I just gave, I stated that the golden cut must be made at approximately the 61% point of the line. In reality, to truly hit the golden ratio, this cut must be made at an exact point that is in between 61% and 62%, i.e. at the 61.8 and then continuing after percent mark. So the exact percent point is actually 0.618033, continuing. It's like pi. It just goes on forever. So that is the exact point. So to actually hit the golden ratio, it's not an approximate point, it's an exact point. But it's approximately at the 61% mark. So only when this cut is made at the exact right point is the golden ratio formed. So just so we don't miss anything, let's go over this again. As a result of the special segmentation of a line, this segmentation being called the golden cut or golden section, 3 values are created. A, the original length of the original line. B, the length of the longer of the 2 line segments formed by the cut. And C, the length of the shorter of the 2 line segments formed by the cut. So you have those 3 values, and they relate together is that the length of the 2 line segments sum together to form the length of the third one, which is the total line. This is intuitive. If you just look at a line that's cut in 2, you'll know that that's true. So the greater, when we measure the exact ratio, the exact proportion between these 3 line segments, they fit into this following proportion. The longer of the lines, meaning the whole line, is going to be adopting the numerical value of phi, which is one of these irregular numbers. So that's the length of the longer. The length of the middle segment, which is actually the longer of the 2 produced by the cut that you made, that specific incision, the longer of those gets the value of 1, the whole number 1. The whole number 1. So the longer of the 2 segments is 1. Now the whole line is phi, and that makes the lesser one, the smaller of the 2 line segments formed by that incision, that adopts the value of what's called phi, which is like a lowercase version of phi. So it's the shorter one, it's phi. So while phi is 1.618, phi is 0.618. And remember, the 2 line segments are going to sum together to form the longer. So if the other one's 1, then if you just subtract 1 from phi, you get phi. And you can also get phi by it's the reciprocal of phi. So they're inverse ratio to each other. So that means that 1 over phi equals phi. So there are numerous ways that these 3 numbers integrate together in this really harmonious way, and there's all kinds of applications for the entire canon of sacred geometry, but also there's all these implications about why in nature we find this pattern. And it's a really amazing pattern because it's almost like a cipher that exists behind nature, a cipher behind number itself that sort of unravels some of the mystery and reveals all these deeper patterns. So those are the actual names of the 3 terms. And so we're going to be going deeper into how these relate to each other. So the golden ratio is mathematically expressed in this 3-term equation by having phi. The symbol for phi is like a capital I with a circle in it, or like the Roman numeral 1 with a circle drawn in the middle. And then phi is the 2 parallel lines, the 2 bars on a capital I or on the Roman numeral. If you take that out and just take the vertical line and you keep the circle, then that's the lowercase version, or that's phi. So that's 0.618, and then phi is 1.618. So that's how those 2 relate. And then so you have phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi, and you write that with 3 terms, and that's how you write the golden ratio. And again, the diagram at the beginning of the section depicts this situation. Just a simple hand-drawn diagram, and gives a couple equations for you of how these 3 numbers relate to each other. But you can really go very deep, and some of these books that I have on the golden section do go very deep into the mathematics. So that's all stuff I'll hopefully go into in a different book. It's too much for this project. So again, it's important to emphasize that the basis of the golden ratio is geometric and not strictly numerical. This is because the numerical values of 2 of the 3 terms of the golden ratio, and these 2 are the greater, which is phi, and the lesser, which is phi. The numerical values of these 2 terms are like pi and a rational number, or irrational numbers that cannot be fully expressed as simple fractions between two integers. Consequently, its decimal representation never ends and repeats indefinitely when you try to write it out in decimal form. I already said that. To find the golden section geometrically, the challenge is to take a single line representing unity and make a single incision such that 3 different line segments of 3 non-repeating lengths are generated as a result. The further challenge is to have these 3 line measurements relate together as a continuous geometric proportion. Only one type of incision can be made to produce this result, and that is the golden section. Based on this special cut, 3 line segments are generated. The greater of these line segments is termed phi, the middle segment is 1, and the lesser is phi. Before moving on, I want to briefly point out how the golden ratio is related to the well-known mathematical pattern known as the Fibonacci sequence. One of the ways that scientists observe the presence of the golden ratio in their studies of nature is that they find a certain set of key numerical values in their measurements, ones which correspond to the Fibonacci numbers. These are a special set of numbers which, when presented in ascending sequence, form an ever-increasing or decreasing, depending on which way you're moving in the sequence, but they form an ever-increasing chain of continuous geometric proportions, which are entirely key to the pattern of the golden ratio. The significance of the Fibonacci sequence is that the ratio between any two consecutive numbers in the series approximates phi in ever greater degrees of exactitude. For example, in the Fibonacci sequence, any number divided by the previous smaller number in the series approximates phi. This holds increasingly true as you go deeper and deeper into the sequence. Thus, the Fibonacci sequence is, as Scott Olsen puts it, forever closing in on the divine limit, which is the golden ratio. So that's one of the ways that we observe the golden ratio's presence in nature, is by observing these Fibonacci numbers and these Fibonacci measurements. But anyway, that is the end of this section, where I just kind of give the basics of the golden section and the golden ratio. So the next section is called Plato, the Golden Ratio, and the Ancient Mysteries. All right, picking back up now, Plato, the Golden Ratio, and the Ancient Mysteries. And as the image for this section, I have taken from one of these great books on sacred geometry that I have, which I can't remember the name of at the moment. I have this diagram of the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which is a great initiation temple of the world, I guess I would say. And you can there's so many books that you can just read on the sacred geometry and the mysteries of the Great Pyramid alone. But in this diagram, it shows that the key underlying architecture of the pyramid is keyed to the geometry of the golden ratio. And in the same book and in other books, other great pyramids and cathedrals and temples of the ancient world, even stretching up to modern times, such as the UN building and some of the other important architectural pieces of recent times, going up going up to modern times even. Anyway, all of them are keyed to the geometry of the golden ratio. So anyway, under this image of the Great Pyramid and this diagram of how it interfaces with the golden ratio, I have a little subheading. So I say, the geometry of the Great Pyramid is key to the mathematics of the golden ratio. This fact holds true for other important religious temples and ceremonial sites throughout the world. From the pyramid temples of the ancient Americas to the construction of the Gothic cathedrals in medieval times, to the layout of the Forbidden City in China, all were designed by master masons who had been initiated into the sacred wisdom teachings associated with phi and the golden ratio. So that was the subheading of that image, and now I'm going to jump right into the main body of this section. The foundational teachings on the golden ratio, at least the ones publicly available for the lay person to access, come down to us from Plato. Even without the writings of Plato, however, we can appreciate the special importance that the ancient priesthood and master masons put on the golden ratio, as this divine proportion is encoded in the architecture of every great sacred temple and religious monument going back to the time of the pyramid builders. It was at these ancient sites that the sacred initiation rituals of the ancient mysteries were performed. Given that the anatomy of the human organism is also keyed to the golden ratio, perhaps there is a link between the sacred rituals performed at these sites and the idea introduced earlier that there is a possibility of establishing a bond of resonance between a system or subsystem, i.e. a microcosm, existing on a lower plane of the cosmic ladder of existence, and a macrocosmic supersystem engulfing and embedding that lesser system as a part to a whole. So this idea of resonance again comes into play about why at various scales of this vast cosmic hierarchy we see this divine proportion encoded. It seems to be a mechanism by which this resonance can take place. So it's likely that the initiation rites of the ancient mysteries were designed around the intent of establishing such a resonance between the initiates of the mystery schools and the greater spiritual self that exists supremely behind physical creation. Once such a resonance was established, the initiate was said to be twice born, meaning that the experience of establishing such a resonance is one of ego death and spiritual rebirth, with the sovereign self, or the divine self, awakening itself through residence within the individual psyche of the initiate. In this way, the initiate becomes God's instrument on earth, with the human organism serving as God's specially designed vehicle or vessel within nature. Through the use of this special instrument, God is able to reawaken its consciousness within its creation and gradually take control over it. So this is what the human being is intended to do, through enlightenment, awaken the divine self within, and then as an awakened instrument becomes the vehicle for the conclusion of this cycle. So man becomes the alchemist over nature itself, but first over himself. And this idea of releasing the spiritual gold is the idea of awakening the self within. So when you do that within, then the self can use you to do its work in the outer world. While many authors and commentators on the golden ratio have noted, in astounding detail at times, that the mathematics of the divine proportion is encoded in many, if not all, of the great temples and monuments of antiquity, what most have missed is how this sacred geometric relationship is also purposefully referenced, albeit in a cryptic, veiled, and intentionally abstract way, throughout the various writings of Plato. Plato is the great Athenian philosopher and sage whose relatively small corpus of teachings have steadily grown in influence to become, through time, perhaps the single most influential body of philosophical teachings in the history of Western civilization. As Scott Olsen has uncovered in his research, there are numerous veiled references to the golden section in Plato's writings. Before proceeding with an analysis of Plato's writings, let's pause and thoughtfully consider the question, why would these references to the golden section be veiled in Plato's and other writings? The implications of the golden ratio, only a couple of which we will touch on here, are vast and profound. Many mysteries are concealed within this simple yet important geometric division of a line. So consequently, because there's so many implications of this, and it plays such an important role in the philosophy of the ancient priesthood, it was kept as part of their sacred arcana, i.e. the heritage of esoteric knowledge that was revealed to man at the origin of our present world cycle and which has been protected in an unbroken lineage through time via a network of priesthoods, esoteric schools, secret societies, and initiatic orders since this point of first origin. And what I'm talking about here is this cycle of the Arya. The golden ratio, the significance of it would have been part of the original revealed teachings of the Arya. But one thing I will note that I talk about this issue, this word of the Arya, and which is the root word of Aryan. And I talk about that with Dr. Debashish Banerjee in an interview that I did with him last year. So that's on the channel, and he'll tell you more about the history and the relationship to India, actually ancient India and ancient Tibet, that this term has, because this would have been the site of this original revelation. So the cycle of the Arya begins in northern India, and this is the same things that Manly Hall teaches. This is what Blavatsky taught in The Secret Doctrine. So this is part of the esoteric teachings. This is part of the framework of esoteric philosophy, this whole understanding of a cycles-based view of existence and how that applies to us today and what kind of cycle we're in and all of that. So this is all fitting together into that picture. So getting back to it, this institution of sacred knowledge, or the mysteries, which the golden ratio would have been a part of, was served by an inner caste of priests who ran the mystery schools of the ancient world. These mysteries were enthroned in the great temple complexes of antiquity, such as the Great Pyramid or the Great Pyramids of the Central and South Americas. So these mysteries were enthroned in these great temple complexes. They were the sites of both great public religious rituals, such as the lesser mysteries were called, as well as the highly secretive spiritual rituals and initiatic rites carried out in absolute privacy. These were the greater mysteries. As a foundational aspect of the esoteric teachings, the golden ratio would have been taught only to initiates. Consequently, only veiled references to it could have been made publicly. Plato, an initiate of this institution, would have been obliged to preserve this tradition and only make veiled reference to it in his public teachings. So that's why he would have only made veiled references to it, because he was an initiate. Plato was undoubtedly an initiate of these mystery schools. And so, therefore, he would have been obligated to... He would have been given permission to do his academy and to do his teachings, but he would have been obligated to present his curriculum and present the teachings in a way that was commensurate with the ancient practices and methods of those mystery schools he had been raised in. So as an initiate of both the Greek and Egyptian mysteries, and as a student of Pythagorean philosophy, Plato was because remember, Pythagoras comes about 100 years before Plato. Plato was someone who would have earned the right to have been initiated into the deeper spiritual teachings and mysteries concerning the esoteric philosophic significance of the golden section and phi. As an initiate, Plato was restrained from revealing the fullness of what he knew about the topic in his public writings and lectures. Instead, he makes only veiled mention of it. Scott Olsen elaborates on this. Quote, Plato, as a Pythagorean, was under an inviolable oath not to reveal the deeper truths of the mystical Pythagorean mathematical order. Like Pythagoras, he spent considerable time in Egypt studying the mathematical mysteries with the priesthood there, and in his writings intentionally conceals deeper truths under a shroud of mystery. As a teacher and writer, Plato presented anomalous puzzles, problems, and incomplete solutions, along with significant hints both within the academy and in his dialogues. The task for the student of esoteric philosophy, whether of Pythagoras and Plato or of a different tradition, is to work out the solution to abstract spiritual problems, ones that will be presented to them in a deliberately cryptic fashion. So this method of instruction is initiatic. This is the initiation has to take place within yourself. So the priesthood can only try to catalyze this growth within you. So that's what the tasks are to be presented with these mysteries. So the mysteries are called that for a reason. The initiatic method of the priesthood was to stimulate and inspire the disciple or initiate to draw upon their own inner resources in order to solve a complex problem or challenge put before them. In his teachings, Plato is following the characteristic initiatic method of the ancient mysteries, the ones he was an initiate of. His pedagogical style should therefore be understood as being initiatic in design and intent. Plato deliberately and with great intentionality sought to stimulate his students to grow and evolve by presenting them with mysteries in the form of challenging puzzles and deliberately enigmatic teachings. These mysteries would be presented to them in order that they may be inspired to accept the challenge being offered and to begin for themselves an internal and external quest to bridge the gap between their current state of understanding and what they need to know and become in order to advance within the initiatic program of the mysteries. It is through this method, i.e. by imitating the archetypal format of the mysteries, that Plato was able to simultaneously reveal and conceal the deeper mysteries of phi and the golden section in his public writings, or in his public teachings. As Scott Olsen further remarks, quote, in the dialogues, Plato carefully selects several interrelated problems that are very subtly posed. Taken together, they point to the great mystery of the golden section. He continues, it is clear from Aristotle and other members of Plato's academy that in his unwritten lectures, Plato more openly revealed the deep truths of how the one combined with the greater and lesser, which is phi and phi, to produce the hierarchy of intelligible forms, mathematics, and sensible particulars. So sensible particulars is the shadow of these archetypes or these intelligible forms. So he's saying in this quote that it's clear from the references of his students that Plato discussed some of these problems that he only hints at in his written public lectures and dialogues. He concludes, yet even to the academy members, the presentation was necessarily enigmatic. In his writings, Scott Olsen has highlighted numerous examples of Plato making veiled reference to the sacred division of the golden section, a few of which I will share here. As an example of how Plato enigmatically both revealed and concealed the sacred importance of the golden section in his writings, Olsen writes, quote, in the Parmenides, which is one of Plato's works, Plato presents the, quote, worst difficulty argument, which asks, how can the immaterial intelligible, i.e. archetypal, and the sensible, i.e. the material, worlds have any contact or interaction with each other? So how can these two things that are like oil and water, that are thesis antithesis of one another, how can they actually have interaction? The answer is not indicated in the same work that presents the problem. Rather, a solution is cryptically suggested or hinted at in another one of his works, the Timaeus, where, as Olsen writes, quote, Plato makes it clear that a continuous geometric proportion is the best of all bonds. This involves there being an intermediate geometric mean relationship between the two opposing extremes, which are, again, the sensible and intelligible worlds. So this means that a golden mean must unite them. This golden mean is the monad, which is the spiritual archetype of the soul. The exact quote of Plato's that Olsen is referencing from the Timaeus is as follows. Quote, "Two things cannot be rightly put together without a third. There must be some bond of union between them. And the fairest bond is that which makes the most complete fusion of itself and the things which it combines. Proportion, or in Greek, analogia, is best adapted to effect such a union. For whenever, in any three numbers, whether cube or square, there is a mean is the average between the two, or the binding element, this third synthesizing principle. So whenever there's a mean between two opposites, which is to the last term what the first term is to it, and again, when the mean is to the first term as the last term is to the mean, again, this is describing the golden ratio, then the mean becoming first and last, and the first and last both becoming means, which means when they're all balanced together, they're all invested with the quality that the mean has over the greater and lesser. The mean is this averaging, this equilibrium providing element. So when the whole thing becomes balanced, then the greater becomes an equalizer to the lesser, and the lesser becomes an equalizer to the greater, and then the golden mean becomes the equalizer to both. And so all of them being equalizers, which is what Plato's saying, they will all by necessity come to be the same, and having become the same with one another will all be one. End quote. Again, that's from Plato in the Timaeus. So that's what he's talking about, this significance, is that once this golden mean does its work and actually brings equilibrium to the greater and the lesser, then the separation between all three of them kind of disappears because all become as one. So that's what he's saying there, is the three become as one, and that becomes the resolution of the sort of great cycle of existence. That's when the archetype is achieved, when the full equilibrium is established. So here we can see that Plato is explicitly referencing a three-term continuous geometric proportion where you have a set of three numbers in which the middle term serves the function of being intermediary and mediator between the first term, i.e. the greater, and the last term, i.e. the lesser, which is phi and phi. In this quote, Plato also references how this median term, which in the case of the golden ratio is the number 1, serves the purpose of offering a, quote, bond of union between the two extreme terms in the set. Again, these being the greater and the lesser, or phi and phi. So the median term serves the purpose of offering a bond of union between the two extreme terms in the set, the greater and the lesser. So how are these two opposites united? By the golden mean. And that's what the golden ratio, phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi, is a objective mathematical representation of this teaching. And that's why we find it encoded in all of the sacred monuments, because it is the fundamental pattern of residence that the whole creation is premised upon, because it's the fundamental thing that marks the partitioning of unity into a trinity, and that marks the cycle of creation, because that marks the creation of the self. So adding further commentary to this is Alexander, as in Alexander the Great, who was a student of Aristotle's, with Aristotle being one of the prize students of Plato's Academy, having studied directly under the master teacher. Concerning Plato's teachings on the golden ratio, in his commentary of the Metaphysics, Alexander writes, quote, "Thinking to prove that the equal and unequal are the first principles of all things, he assigned equality to the monad and inequality to excess and defect, i.e. the greater and lesser. For inequality involves two things, a great and a small, which are excessive and defective." So again, he's just kind of in a veiled reference making note of the phi and phi relationship in the golden ratio. So here Alexander is once again emphasizing Plato's point that the bond between the greater, which he also calls the excessive, which is phi, and the lesser, which he calls the defective, and which is phi. So the bond between the two is provided by the monad, i.e. the one, or the golden mean. This confirms the notion that what Plato is making veiled reference to in his writings is indeed the golden section. In another quote, this from the Republic, Plato starts to unpack some of the deeper philosophical meaning between the dialectic of the greater and lesser and the role that the golden mean plays in uniting them. In particular, in one line of this famous work, Plato writes, quote, Suppose you have a line divided into two unequal parts to represent the visible and intelligible orders. Here, Plato is equating the greater, or phi, with the intelligible world of archetypes, and the lesser, or phi, with the visible world of material forms. Olsen further elaborates on the significance of this quote from the Republic. Quote, in the Republic, Plato asks us to divide the line unevenly, representing the intelligible and sensible worlds. In effect, he is telling us to generate a continuous geometric proportion between the whole and the parts with the simplest of all cuts, the golden cut, or the golden section. When we apply the same ratio, the golden cut, to the two segments, we now get the most interesting geometric proportion between the parts, which is phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. This geometric proportion is the golden ratio. Olsen continues, thus the worst difficulty argument is answered through continuous geometric proportion. The intelligible and visible worlds are interlocked, interlaced, and fused together through the influence of the golden mean and its greater and lesser relationships with unity. So the golden mean unites the two extremes. So even though you have two opposing elements, they are bound together as one by this third element, so that all three are actually as one. So unity always remains supreme over all. In the Timaeus, Plato again touches on the philosophic meaning of these two extremes, the greater and the lesser, while also drawing an association between the monad, i.e. the golden mean, and the world soul, which, like Atlas, serves to bind together the opposing dimensions of heaven and earth, one comparatively excessive with spirit, the other comparatively deficient. Plato writes that, quote, the world soul binds together into one harmonic resonance the intelligible world of forms, i.e. archetypes, and the visible world of material objects. Here we find a restatement of a truth that is foundational to the ancient esoteric teachings, that the world soul is the intermediary and intercessor through which the energies of heaven move down into and fertilize the material elements of earth. So earth is the lesser, heaven's the greater, and the world soul is the monad, becomes the one that contains the all. So remember, the monad emerges in our earlier discussion, in the earlier sections on this Pythagorean system. The monad and the one sort of oppose each other, and these are like the greater and the lesser. The monad is of the greater world, and the one is of the lesser. This is the numerical one, but both of those together are the yang-yin elements of unity, and unity is like the Tao. So we have the Tao, and then the yang and yin as these mutually interacting elements that become the foundation of creation. And so the monad and the one become these two elements. And so this world soul is the intermediary intercessor. So what we call material reality is actually the end product of this triadic motion of consciousness moving into mind or soul to create and inhabit a world of material form as an end result. So again, father, mother, child. That's the triad. In a final quote, this one from the Statesman, Plato draws an analogy between the fundamental values of philosophy, which are to serve the good and release the beautiful, and the function that the golden mean plays within the golden ratio in relation to heaven and earth, the two extremes of greater and lesser. So what I'm trying to say here is that the way of philosophy, or the fundamental values of philosophy, are represented also in this golden section, because one is the philosopher is supposed to be like the golden mean, or like the monad, the one that binds together the two opposites, two extremes. So Plato writes, quote, the greater and the lesser are to be measured in relation not only to one another, but also to the establishment of the standard of the mean being the average between the two, the golden mean. This other factor comprises that which measures them in relation to the moderate, the fitting, the opportune, the needful, and all the other standards that are situated in the mean between extremes. So he's associating the mean, this idea of the mean, with that which is situated between the extremes. It is in this way, when they preserve the standard of the mean, that all their works are good and beautiful. That's a quote, again, from Plato. When they preserve the standard of the mean, or when one becomes like the golden mean, then one's works then become necessarily good and beautiful, because that's what the golden mean represents, is this synthesizing, beauty making, goodness releasing factor. And that's exactly what the Te is in Chinese philosophy, as we'll see. What Plato is implying is that the soul plays the role of intermediary and intercessor, i.e. as the golden mean, between the spiritual and material worlds, the former being the greater and the latter the lesser. By serving the soul within, the philosopher brings balance to the spiritual and material aspects of his own nature. Thus, we find in philosophy an emphasis on walking the middle path, or the middle way. It is the way of philosophy to walk this middle path, i.e., to consider the relationship between two extremes and walk purposefully between them, mediating one by means of the other and vice versa, meaning bringing equilibrium to both by balancing them in relation to each other. Now, in a lot of images of alchemy, you'll see the figure with a sun and moon on over either hand, or a sun and moon on either side of himself. So that represents two extremes, and you're in the middle. And also in the sort of cryptic diagrams associated with Francis Bacon's publishing, you'll see two pillars and a ship sailing between them. And that, again, that's this middle path between two extremes. It's the way of philosophy. The challenge for the initiate of the mysteries is to keep always to this middle path in order that they always serve the good and release the beautiful. By doing so, they gradually bring balance to all extremes, including those existing both within and without, meaning internally and externally. This is the service to God that the philosopher performs. He becomes the alchemist, the balancer of forces, the equalizer of energies. In this way, as Plato tells us, by keeping to the middle path, the philosopher balances the greater and the lesser. And when this happens, the greater and lesser both become, quote, means to each other. As in Plato's words, they become means to each other. They average each other out. They equalize each other. Meaning they become equilibrated together. I know I'm mispronouncing this, but equilibrated together such that each extreme brings balance to its counterpart. And when that happens, they will all of them, again quoting Plato, they will all of them by necessity come to be the same. And having become the same with one another, will all be one. End quote. Again, that's Plato. And that's the end of this section. So the next section is called Triangulation and the Philosophy of Equilibrium. And as an example of triangulation, I present a chart that I presented earlier in the series. I'm representing it, and this is taken from one of Manly Hall's early works. And it's a diagram of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva expressed as these series of triangulations, as these series of triads. And how it shows how they all relate to each other. So this is an example of how triangulation is used to disambiguate the meaning of religious mythology. And so the same method of triangulation you apply to all things, including in Pythagorean philosophy, you're applying it to the philosophy of number. So beginning this section now, again entitled Triangulation and the Philosophy of Equilibrium. Throughout this series on Pythagorean philosophy, we've discussed at length the philosophical significance of the number 3, or as the Pythagoreans called it, the triad. In our analysis of the golden ratio, we find the core elements of the Pythagorean triad restated in objective geometric and mathematical terms. With the golden ratio, we also find the 3 core principles of the triad, the greater, the lesser, and the golden mean, expressed in a form that can be scientifically studied and observed throughout nature. In this light, we can appreciate how the golden ratio forms a link between the abstract philosophical teachings of the Pythagoreans and the contemporary research being done by scientists and mathematicians today. Thus, the golden ratio is a bridge uniting ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. In our earlier discussion of the philosophical meaning of the Pythagorean triad, we associate it with the emergence of the divine self, the unified being whose supreme consciousness is the single sovereign power and source of all individual beings and life forms that are made manifest within the universe of material creation. So the triad is the foundation. This divine self, born as the child of the father-mother principles of the Godhead, adopts a threefold constitution and the ontological design of its being, meaning it possesses a spirit inherited from its father, a material form inherited from its mother, and between them it possesses a soul which serves as intermediary between the two. In the golden ratio, we find this teaching re-expressed. The world of spirit is associated with the greater, the world of material form is associated with the lesser, and the golden mean uniting them is associated with the world soul, whose form takes the shape of a grand man. Remember, we made this point in our last article. Plato tells us this directly when he writes, quote, "The world soul, i.e. the monad or the golden mean, binds together into one harmonic resonance the intelligible world of forms and the visible world of material objects." So the intelligible world and the visible world are bound together by the world soul. So the greater, the lesser, and the equilibrium synthesis uniting factor between them, that's the soul. The means by which the soul binds them together, meaning the intelligible and the sensible, or the intelligible and the visible world, is by establishing equilibrium between them. So this is the function that the world soul plays in relation to heaven and earth. And in relation to man's existence, which is a microcosm of the world, his own soul serves this same function. It unites his greater spiritual aspect and his lesser material nature. As discussed above, this passage is essentially advocating for the philosopher to walk the middle path between two extremes. In this way, from the vantage point of the middle, the philosopher can work to balance one extreme with the other, the end goal being to ultimately bring the extremes into equilibrium with each other. In this way, through philosophy, i.e. the walking of the middle path, the extremes of life will, quote again to Plato, will all of them of necessity come to be the same, and having become the same with one another will all be one. So that's the middle path. Here we discover the underlying reason behind philosophy's use of the triangulation method. The philosopher breaks all problems into three so that they may locate the extremes while also pinpointing the middle path existing subtly between them. Manly P. Hall, the 20th century's greatest authority on esoteric philosophy, reveals to us the simple but powerful adage that three is God in philosophy. This is a quote from Manly Hall. Three is God in philosophy. He then concludes that in order to think with God, the philosopher must, quote, in all aspects of life triangulate, meaning find three essential points, end quote. That's what Manly Hall says. In all aspects of life triangulate, find three essential points. What he's implying by these simple statements is that God manifests its unified being as a trinity or triad. This triad is necessary for the unbound consciousness of unity to become focused by mind into an experience of self-consciousness. Being products of the creation that this triadic divine self has fashioned, we must learn to think with our God and come to appreciate the fact that God works and builds within creation in terms of threes. By means of triangulation, the philosopher seeks to locate divinity's presence in all things, a presence that always expresses itself within creation in terms of a triad. Therefore, by means of triangulation, God's presence is revealed to man's faculties of intellect and reason. Once awakened to this knowledge, the philosopher can locate all extremes and walk the middle path between them. So that's the end of that section. All right, next section is called Yang, Yin, and Te. And so the objective here is to go back over these same core principles of the golden ratio and see how, as well as the core principles of the Pythagorean triad, and see how the philosophy of Taoism works with them and how it presents these same ideas. So this section kicks off with me writing, as we just discussed, the triad of the divine self reveals itself as a triangulation between three principles that together form a set. The golden ratio presents the mathematical archetype for how these three terms in the set relate to each other. In the golden ratio, we find the statement, phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi, or the greater is to 1 as 1 is to the lesser. Here we find two opposing extremes, the greater and the lesser, balanced by a third synthesizing factor, which is the golden mean. In the ancient Chinese philosophy of Taoism, we find a similar triad of principles enthroned at the foundation of their teachings, that of yin, yang, and te. Te is te with like an accent on it. While Pythagorean philosophy is founded on the concept of absolute unity, ancient Chinese philosophy is founded upon the ultimate principle of the Tao. In the Taoist system, the term Tao essentially covers the same core ideas as the Pythagorean principle of unity. In the Pythagorean system, unity becomes a triad when oneness partitions itself into an inseparably interwoven trinity of three interconnected principles. In the language of the golden section, these three principles are the greater, the lesser, and the golden mean, which unites and binds the two opposing polarities of greater and lesser. In the Chinese system, we find a similar pattern of divine unfoldment, with the Tao, like unity, manifesting its universal consciousness by partitioning itself into a triad of three interconnected principles. The Taoists term these three principles Yang, Yin, and Te. Here, Yang and Yin play the role of two divergent extremes. They are two opposites, one excessive, which is Yang, and one deficient, which is Yin. As opposites, they eternally counterpose each other. They are opposites, but neither can exist without the counterweight of each other. In between this dialectic exists a third subtle principle, what the Taoists termed Te. This third synthesizing principle is connected to both yin and yang and serves to bring balance and equilibrium to their duality. In the Chinese system, Te functions somewhat like an ambassador of the Tao, which is again unity. So it's like an ambassador of the Tao within creation, which is the world of diversity. Much like the monad or golden mean of the Pythagorean system, the Te principle works among, within, and between the yin and yang dialectic. Its function is to balance and equilibrate yang and yin such that in time, at the conclusion of the cycle, again quoting Plato, all will be one, and universal creation will come to completion. So Te is like the grace of God acting upon the two extremes, and this grace gradually brings them both into equilibrium. And then they'll all again be one. So at the conclusion of this cycle of creation, the three elements of the triad, all having become one, dissolve their boundaries that separate one from the other. Their task complete, these three principles of the triad are then restored to the eternal condition of absolute unity, or the Tao. Here, these principles will rest until their eventual reactivation in a future cycle of existence. So that's the conclusion of that section, trying to draw an association between Taoism and Pythagorean philosophy and the golden ratio, and show how these each deal with a triangulation of principles that follow the same core pattern. So this core pattern is what we're going to look at more in this next section. It's called thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Regarding our current discussion of philosophy's use of the triangulation method, the work of 17th century philosopher Friedrich Hegel offers us a valuable framework of insights that we can use to unravel and disambiguate the underlying relationship dynamic that underpins the Pythagorean principle of the triad. The pattern we've been working with so far concerns the existence of a fundamental archetypal triad of principles. Within this set of three principles, two oppose each other as inverse extremes, while a third element exists between them and works to balance and equilibrate them. In Hegel's philosophy, the basic semantic pattern involved with this three principle set is described in terms of the three elements of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Here we find two opposing polarities, thesis and antithesis, interacting through a third intermediary agent, the synthesis. This third agent is an integrating synthesizing principle, one which, as Manly P. Hall writes, lies at the equilibrium between 2 points, evaluating two dissimilars from the vantage point of the middle. So I want to read that again. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The third agent, the synthesis, is an integrating synthesizing principle. It balances, it brings equilibrium. That's what synthesis means. That lies at, quote, the equilibrium between 2 points, evaluating two dissimilars from the vantage point of the middle. This is one of those veiled quotes that Manly has, that Manly Hall has, that he seems to be referencing the golden ratio, because it's the same pattern that he's saying. Equilibrium between 2 points, the golden mean. What I've been calling triangulation is really a specialized philosophic discipline in which the philosopher learns to always frame their analysis of the world according to the core pattern of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis methodology. In this way, the philosophic method of triangulation describes a technique for establishing a fixed pattern of value between three variables bound together within a set. Here, each of the three variables in the set is given a specific name, position, and function in relation to the other two. This designation specifies the distinct role that each variable in the set will play in relation to its two other counterparts. So this is what a thesis, antithesis, synthesis set is. It's a set of three principles that are each playing a functional role in relation to this set of three. The whole set is the whole, and each of these terms plays a part within the whole. That's basically what I'm saying. So just like in the golden ratio, each of the three terms is necessary and plays a particular role in the overall meaning of the triangulation. So the three role categories that are contained within each triangulated set are thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Within each set of three concepts that one is triangulating, each individual term will be slotted into one of these three archetypal role positions, meaning one of the three terms must play the role of thesis, another the role of antithesis, and the third the role of synthesis, meaning whatever variables you're putting in this equation, they have to fit these role categories, or it won't work. So the two concepts occupying the positions of thesis and antithesis form a precise pattern of relationship with each other that is dialectical. This means that the two terms oppose each other as inverse opposites. Simple examples of this include light and dark, good and bad, day and night, or the greater and the lesser, in the case of the golden ratio. The method here is to first specify a thesis, and then you attempt to locate a dialectically opposite concept, an antithesis. So for example, if light is taken as the thesis, then by necessity dark must play the role of antithesis. In this way, a fixed pattern of semantic value is established between the pair. Each is given a value and purpose in relation to the other. So in other words, each plays a specific role in relation to its counterpart. Light plays the role of fullness, darkness plays the role of emptiness. Once this thesis-antithesis pairing has been established, one then moves to specify the third position in the triad, the synthesis. Thesis and antithesis, being opposites, do not directly interact. They are like oil and water. They naturally oppose and separate from one another. Imagine them like the positive and negative poles of a battery. They fit together, but they also oppose each other. To overcome this position, a third integrating factor must be introduced, one that can integrate, balance, and synthesize the two counterposed extremes together. In this way, through the introduction of this third element of synthesis, the two dialectical opposites of thesis and antithesis are brought into an increasing state of functional interaction. In our battery example, this synthesis represents the concept of the magnetic field that emerges in space and time in order to direct the flow of energy moving from the positive pole to the negative pole. Through this magnetic field, the two opposites of positive and negative are brought into a state of mutual constructive interaction. The mission of the synthesis is thus to bring the variance between the two extremes into a state of relative equilibrium with each other. Left alone, opposing things tend to come into conflict, but with the aid of a third element that synthesizes, the pair can be brought into a state of productive and harmonious relationship. In total, the role of synthesis performs two key functions in relation to the two extremes it's existing alongside of. First, it functions as a catalyst for their mutual interaction, and second, it serves as a balancing, mediating, and equilibrating agent whose purpose is to bring their opposing energies into a state of integrated and unified functioning. So the synthesis is a catalyst for interaction, but also an agent of balance and equilibrium. Keeping this discussion of the Hegelian dialectic, as this is called, this thesis, antithesis, synthesis pattern, the Hegelian dialectic, let's return to the topic of the golden ratio to see how its three elements fit in with Hegel's scheme. In the case of the golden ratio, the roles of thesis and antithesis are played by phi and phi, the former being the greater, the latter the lesser. The role of synthesis, meanwhile, is played by the monad, which, as the golden mean, symbolizes the rulership of oneness over duality and of unity over diversity. The interplay between these two opposing principles, yang and yin, or greater and lesser, is the foundation of creation. Without them, a world of individualized life forms, each undergoing its own unique experience of self-consciousness, could never be had. So without the dialectic, you can never have what we consider creation. So it's the interaction between these two principles is what generates creation. But creation is brought into balance and order and law through this third synthesizing element. So the world of duality exists for a reason, plan, and purpose. It serves as a so-called platform of experience for the divine self to vivify and inhabit with its consciousness. But while the duad, or yang and yin, greater and lesser, makes an experience of diversity possible, the subtle presence of a third factor, the golden mean, ensures that this experience of diversity will end in the rediscovery of unity as the foundation and destiny of things. So by walking the middle path, the philosopher identifies with unity over diversity and thereby becomes an agent for the restoration of unity within the world of created things. That's the end of that section. Next section is called the philosophical significance of the golden ratio. All right, so this section I start off with a quote from Johannes Kepler, actually. I want you to listen to this. Geometry has two great treasures. One is the theorem of Pythagoras. The other, the division of a line into extreme and mean ratio. The first we may compare to a measure of gold. The second we may name a precious jewel. From Johannes Kepler. In a previous discussion of the philosophic meaning of the triad, covered in part 2 of this series on Pythagorean philosophy, I concluded that, quote, 3 represents the rulership of unity over diversity. I also wrote that, quote, duality can only exist within the superior context of unity. Therefore, there is always unity over top, within, and throughout diversity. As I hope you can now see, the golden ratio is the ideal mathematical representation of this profound spiritual truth. That behind, within, and throughout this universe of individualized self-conscious experience is one self, one consciousness, and one mind. This underlying oneness is revealed through the golden mean, which symbolizes the triune nature of the world soul. This world soul is the macrocosm, the grand man of the Zohar, as the Kabbalists called it, with his head in heaven, the greater world, and his feet upon the earth, the lesser world. As the golden section informs us, before the triadic nature of this world soul was first brought into formation, there was unity. So in the beginning, there was unity. In the geometry of the golden ratio, we find that before the golden cut was first made, and the golden cut is that single incision that establishes the 3-part proportion we call the golden ratio. Before this cut is made, there was at the beginning a single unified line, meaning in the beginning there was unity. Then in a single creative act, a cut is made and a trinity is established. But this trinity only exists in relation to the original uncut line, which always remains as the foundation. So this uncut line is the background context of unity, without which the triad's existence would be impossible. Thus we find unity as the ruler of creation, not just above creation in the form of the original line, but also within creation through the presence of the golden mean, where, as the monad, it subtly rules over the world of diversity it has fashioned. A world whose basis is the interplay of a fundamental duality, yang and yin, the greater and the lesser. In truth, by pointing us toward the golden ratio, Plato is simply teaching us to walk the middle path. Manly P. Hall makes the same point in his various teachings, where he informs us that the opposite of evil is not good. Rather, evil represents one form of extreme that will always be counterbalanced by another form of extreme, i.e. by another evil. So if evil counterposes itself, then good must lie at the middle, synthesizing point between them. Good does not diametrically oppose evil, rather the good resides at the golden mean between two relative extremes or two relative evils. Good is that which works between them to balance and bring equilibrium such that all extremes will be balanced against each other. So it works between them to balance and equilibrate all extremes together. And this way, evil is overcome and only good remains. And that's the point that Plato was making in that earlier quote that we cited. Simply put, the philosophical significance of the golden section is that it provides an objective scientific justification for philosophy's hallmark teaching of the middle way. The teachings of this way are found in Buddhism, Taoism, and in all other great systems of philosophy that follow in the footsteps of the original Aryan revelations. The way of life taught by the great philosophers of old is the way of equilibrium. This is the way of the golden mean, which is the way of becoming an equilibrating agent who works between two extremes in order to gradually establish a relationship of perfect balance between them. Then, to again quote Plato, having become the same with one another, all will be one. And that's the end of that section. So 2 more to go. So the next section is called Philosophy is the Way of Equilibrium. In sum, the fulfillment of the plan for creation is accomplished through the attainment of equilibrium between all imbalanced parts and forces. 3 is the symbol of equilibrium in space. Through equilibrium, 3 principles unite and act as one. Things therefore grow toward unity by becoming equilibrated. Through equilibrium, total being gradually restores the fact of unity on the plane of diversified existence. Equilibrium applied to motion results in the gradual suspension of motion. What this means is that in the fullness of time, the one divine self gradually exhausts its own desire to maintain itself as an individuality. Because the individuality of the self is marked as this cycle of time. So in the fullness of time, this desire of the self to maintain this existence by maintaining its own triadic organization becomes exhausted. And so this exhaustion manifests as a balancing of the yin and yang elements, whose separation marked the onset of this cycle. And they maintain their separation throughout the cycle, but as the cycle ends, they no longer maintain that separation. So this is what I'm referring to here. So by overcoming its desire, meaning the divine self's desire to participate in the cycle of conflict and separation required to sustain its own individuality, the consciousness within the self again returns itself to its primordial state of unity, where self and not self, the great dialectic or duality of self and not self, are reunited as one. This is what Plato was saying. All things becoming the same, then they become as one. The process of unity restating its sovereign authority over duality is accomplished through an adherence to the principle of 3. As Manly Hall stated, in the worldview of philosophy, God is 3. So through 3, unity is restored, but at the fullness of time. So unity always remains behind diversity or behind this trinity, but the trinity can then reabsorb back into unity. That only happens at the end of time, at the fullness of the cycle. So until then, as part of the creation, we, as philosophers, must understand that God is 3 to us. God is actually 1, but we can't engage with God as 1, so we must engage with God as 3. So through the equilibrium of 3, all imbalanced forces inevitably are returned to an unconditioned state of absolute unity. In this state, all things find perfect equilibrium. By thinking, acting, feeling, and perceiving in terms of 3, the philosopher learns to walk the middle path and keep to the golden mean. In this way, through philosophy, one learns to serve God and the divine plan with every aspect of their being. So by living a life that's triangulated, and by perceiving and feeling and disciplining oneself into this triangulation philosophy, one learns to think and live as God creates. So you create a resonance between yourself as a system and God as the super system. So you learn to serve that plan through this resonance with every aspect of your being because you're resonating with it. The ubiquitous presence of the golden ratio within the natural world is testament to the ubiquitous presence of God behind and within manifest creation. It serves as a type of, quote, proof of concept for the abstract thinking of the Pythagoreans and other sects of esoteric philosophy. The golden ratio is an objective expression of the value and importance of equilibrium and the growth and evolution of life. Equilibrium is a divine attribute, one that the Pythagoreans have traditionally associated with their sacred principle of the triad. By working to find and establish equilibrium in ourselves, in society, and in nature as a whole, we become ambassadors of the golden mean, meaning we become instruments for equilibrium's release within a world of creation that is fraught with imbalances. Looking within ourselves at the fundamental design blueprint of human anatomy, we find evidence of this truth everywhere. That man is designed according to the measure of God in order to be a perfect servant of God. So what I mean by this is that the anatomical design of the human being is infused with the sacred geometry and mathematics of the golden ratio. Each of us is at root an expression of a divine design. Being expressions of it, we must learn to become like it. to follow its example, for it is the archetype upon which our very existence depends. It is therefore our destiny to learn the law and obey the law, and this law is one of equilibrium. When man learns to value, understand, and imitate equilibrium, then we become conscious participants in the fulfillment of the divine plan. Only by dedicating oneself toward living according to this way of life, the way of the middle path, or the way of the golden mean, can one rightly call themselves a philosopher. Pythagoras invented the term. This is what he intended by it. Anything that is not in alignment with this teaching should not rightly be called philosophy. To resurrect the institution, we must reestablish its dignity by taking away everything else that falls short of its standard. So even if something advertises itself as philosophy, if it doesn't meet this standard, it doesn't qualify. When we follow the way that Pythagoras and Plato have pointed us towards, and by the way, I mean the path, the middle path, meaning when we embody the golden mean in our thoughts and actions, we assist God and nature in their grand project of reestablishing perfect equilibrium between heaven and earth. Mankind is designed as an instrument or agent of transformation in nature. We are collectively the chosen vehicle through which the grand alchemical transmutation of nature is destined to take place. First, the alchemical transformation must take place within man himself. Then, through a regenerated and spiritually awakened man, or the initiate or the adept, mankind accomplishes the larger transformation within nature itself. And what this larger transformation is, the macrocosm as a whole becomes balanced and brought into equilibrium. First, the alchemical transformation must take place within man himself. Then, through a regenerated and spiritually awakened human, mankind accomplishes the larger transformation within nature itself. This means that all forces within the macrocosm or the world as a whole are balanced and brought into equilibrium, with heaven and earth reunited as one. When this happens, the cycle is complete or comes to completion, and man's great labor is finished. So that's the end of that section. The final section, the golden mean and the destiny of man. The Pythagoreans regarded the pentagram or five-pointed star as the symbol of the soul, the human soul, the microcosm, but also the world soul as a whole, the macrocosm. For this reason, 5 represents the divine power of soul, both within man and within nature. The power of the pentad resides within the world soul itself. Man, a microcosm of this world soul, channels this power and serves as a gateway or vessel through which it is made manifest within the world of creation. The power of 5 within man is the 5th element or quintessence lording over the lower 4 elements of the body. In Pythagorean philosophy, 5 is regarded as the number of the human soul. The perfected human soul is expressed through the archetypal figure of the Hierophant or high priest of the mysteries, an enlightened godlike human who exists as a foreshadowing of what we all are destined to one day become. Fully realized beings, i.e. bodhisattvas, who have molded themselves into the likeness of their own divinely designed archetype. These divine humans have awakened divinity within themselves and exist to further this awakening within their fellow man. So these divine humans are the adepts or the hierophants, or, they go by many names, but they are enlightened humans, and what that means is you've awakened divinity. In relation to the Pythagorean school, Pythagoras was this hierophant. He was the adept of the school. It is not a coincidence, then, that this sect used the pentagram as the chosen emblem of their society. It symbolized not only the sage who founded the school, but also the divine power that his teachings in school were intended to serve and to channel. So it's the power of soul, the world soul coming in through man as this enlightening agent. Esoterically, the symbol of the pentad also encodes important elements of the Pythagorean teachings, including those regarding the mystery of the golden ratio. For example, the five-pointed star or pentagram, which is the archetypal symbol that the Pythagoreans chose for both their school as a whole, as well as to their numerical principle of the pentad. So the pentagram is also the symbol of the number 5 for them. So this archetypal symbol encodes the golden section throughout its dimensions. So a simple five-pointed star, you may not have noticed this, but it encodes the golden section. The 5 lines that form the pentagram intersect at points that mark a golden ratio division. Thus, there are 2 golden section cuts made to each of the 5 lines that comprise the pentagram. And I have a little diagram on here of the article showing how the golden ratio is encoded in the lines of the pentagram. The numeric disambiguation of 5 also gives further clues that unlock important aspects of the Pythagorean doctrine. For example, mathematically, 5 can be formed 2 ways, as the sum of 3 and 2, or as the sum of 4 and 1. As the sum of 4 and 1, the pentad wields the power of the ether, the 5th element, or quintessence, which integrates and synthesizes the 4 lower elements together. As the sum of 3 and 2, the soul of man is composed of the equilibrium of spirit, pertaining to the triad or 3, and the duality of mind, pertaining to the duad or 2. So you see, each of the disambiguations of the number 5 tell us something about it. So spirit is 3 and the mind is 2. The mind is also 4. So 2 and 4 are both representing mind. These receptive yin principles, and then 3 represents the yang. So 5 is the sum of yin and yang. These 2 principles, the triad and the duad, together represent the solar and lunar aspects of creation, the father-mother principles that together give birth to the macrocosm and microcosm alike. So the triad and the duad are the sun and moon. These 2 opposing principles, representing the yang and yin principles of creation, again 3 and 2, or also you could say 3 and 4, are the fundamental elements that the initiate is challenged to bring into equilibrium within his own life. Only once the initiate has attained this for himself will he then be entrusted with the power to accomplish this alchemical act within the larger world environment. This is important. This is the basis of not only philosophy, but also of alchemy. And it's the basis of this idea of overcoming the old pattern of vicarious atonement. Because in philosophy, everybody's responsible for their own salvation, so to speak. There's no outsourcing it to an institution or another individual. Everybody has to work out their own karma and use the disciplines of philosophy to do so. In this way, the pentad, the power of the human soul, is the agent of restoration for equilibrium within the world of form. This he accomplishes by becoming the alchemist and harnessing the power of the ether to transmute all base metals into gold. The universe in its natural state is in equilibrium. There is balance so that nothing dominates. To become the alchemist, man must rediscover and discipline himself according to nature's perfect, innate demonstration of this equilibrium. This equilibrium is the law. So we must learn the law and obey the law. By following law, man becomes like nature, a balancer of forces and a bringer of equilibrium. Whether we discover the truth of the law or not, meaning the truth of equilibrium, it will nonetheless continue to act on us in the form of karma or consequence. As Manly Hall informs us, equilibrium is actually indestructible, but man is afforded the capacity to manipulate this balance. Therefore, man has the power to create or destroy equilibrium within himself and others, but does not have this power within nature as a totality. Rather, nature as a whole has the ultimate power of law over him. All other creations of God naturally obey law. Only man has the power to disobey in order to pursue inner ego-oriented urges and desires. Disease inevitably results from man's fall into such a state of imbalance, with the alchemist serving as the golden mean who restores balance to these forces, and in so doing returns life to a state of health. So health is a state of balance and equilibrium, and disease is a state of imbalance and disequilibrium. As the alchemist, man's purpose is to bring about a balance in nature's elemental forces. In this way, he imitates the way of God, which is the way of equilibrium. As Manly Hall explains, the human is the master of nature. Man's role in nature is to ensure equilibrium in the environment in which he exists. Hall later elaborates, writing that, quote, man himself exists only through a balance of forces, which he must preserve. He can only achieve this by attaining wisdom through the development of the intellect. Quote from Manly Hall. So wisdom is 3, intellect is 4, and man himself as a balance of forces is 5. 3, 4, 5 triangle again. Unpacking this statement further, we can say that man, as the alchemist, embodies in his pentagonal soul design the divine quality of equilibrium, which is innate to God, the triad. Because remember, this triad is encoded in the pentad. The 5-pointed star encodes the golden section all over itself. So that's man being impressed with this fundamental pattern of God. By harnessing the power of equilibrium, the human soul becomes a channel for the release of God's innate quality within the world of creation, this quality being that of equilibrium. So man, as the alchemist, is the bringer of equilibrium. This he accomplishes by becoming a balancer of all opposing forces, elements, and principles in his nature. This is the specific role in the grand hierarchy of creation we are designed to play. It is therefore written in our soul's archetype that we must evolve, each of us, to become the alchemist. Only in so doing will we gain the wisdom, intelligence, and insight necessary to fulfill the divine purpose we have been designed and created to accomplish. As the alchemist, man has the power to unite the 4 lower elements within himself and thereby awaken his consciousness to a 5th enlightened state of understanding associated with the element ether. This awakening is one in which the universal self awakens itself within the individual self of a human personality. Once awakened, this universal self becomes the guiding light of the individual human soul's actions and directives here on earth. The alchemist is the awakened human who has accomplished the great work within themselves. Only after having attained this feat within is the alchemist then granted the knowledge and opportunity to pursue the accomplishment of this divine work within the greater environment of the world soul itself. The alchemist is actually just another name for the philosopher. There is only one way, and those who embody this way serve God and their fellow man alike. So you call him the alchemist, you call it the philosopher, it doesn't matter, it's the same. Call it the Taoist, call it the Buddhist, call it the Christian. In their ideal form, it's all the same. It's all the way. One way. The philosopher or alchemist is properly born through the initiations of the mysteries, i.e. the schoolhouse of the cosmic mother. Once born, they work on behalf of God to bring the world soul's great cycle of existence towards its predestined state of ultimate conclusion. This omega state, the predestined end state that all evolution is being pulled toward, is one of a great return of individual existence to ultimate existence, i.e. of diversity back into the primordial state of absolute unity, the Tao, the Mahaparinirvana. This is the service, that of becoming awakened, dedicated servants to the fulfillment of the divine plan, that we as humans have the privilege of offering to God. This is the way of philosophy, the way of the Tao, the way of the Bodhisattva. There are many names, but there has only ever been one way, the way of equilibrium. And with that, I conclude this series on Pythagorean philosophy. Thank you very much. God bless.